Have you ever stopped to think that everything we know about the past might be a well-told lie? History, the way we learn it in books, often isn't the truth. It's the version told by the people who won. But what happens to the voices of the defeated, the forgotten, the silenced? In this video, we're diving into the philosophy of power behind the phrase, "History is written by the winners." Get ready to question everything you've been taught. Imagine waking up in a world where everything you know about the past might have been rewritten. Not by accident, but on purpose. A world where facts are shaped, erased, or twisted by the people in power. That's not just fiction. It's the core warning George Orwell gives us in 1984 when he says, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." That line is more than a warning. It's a reflection of how authoritarian regimes have worked throughout history. And, in more subtle ways, it's still a risk even in democratic societies. When history is manipulated, it stops being shared memory and becomes a weapon of domination. Controlling the historical narrative allows the powerful to shape not only how we understand the past, but how we see the present and what we believe is possible in the future. Orwell shows a government that constantly rewrites records to match the official version of reality. The main character, Winston Smith, works at the Ministry of Truth, an institution that, ironically, exists to erase and replace information. Newspapers, books, photos, documents, everything is edited to support the government's lies. And once there are no records left of what really happened, the lie becomes the new truth. That's the real danger. When collective memory is manufactured, we don't just forget what happened. We lose the ability to question. After all, how do you resist something that officially never happened? How do you doubt a past that looks so clean and consistent in textbooks, in schools, in monuments? This isn't limited to fiction. Real history is full of examples of rewriting and manipulation. Empires, dictatorships, and even democratic governments have used historical erasure as a strategy. What doesn't fit gets silenced. What's embarrassing gets removed. What's inconvenient gets reinterpreted. Think about how many indigenous stories were suppressed to build the idea of discovery in the Americas. How many black voices were erased to support heroic narratives of colonization? How many atrocities were renamed civilizing progress? History is often written by the winners. But Orwell shows something even darker. It can be rewritten again and again by whoever stays in power. And this control doesn't always happen through force. A lot of the time, it happens through culture, education, media, and language. Who decides what goes into school textbooks? Who chooses which heroes we celebrate and which events we mourn? Those choices shape our collective identity and set the limits of what we can imagine as possible or even desirable. Manipulating history is such an effective form of control because it works at the level of consciousness. A people who don't know their history become more vulnerable to domination. When we don't know where we came from, we're more likely to accept any direction we're given. When we forget the struggles of the past, we risk repeating the same mistakes, or even believing that no struggle ever existed in the first place. Philosopher Hannah Arendt, when analyzing totalitarian regimes, reinforces this by showing that destroying factual truth is one of the first steps toward absolute domination. Without shared facts, public debate collapses. Without a common memory, society loses its critical foundation. And when that happens, people stop being citizens and become objects of the official narrative. This doesn't mean history should be frozen or treated as untouchable. Every version of history involves interpretation. But there's a difference between interpreting facts and erasing, falsifying, or inventing events. The danger is replacing truth with versions that benefit certain groups, usually the ones with political, economic, or ideological power. This also helps us understand the world we live in right now. Today, we're surrounded by endless information, but also by fake news, revisionism, and conspiracy narratives. Technology, which could have made truth more accessible, is also used to confuse, divide, and manipulate. It has never been easier to edit a video, alter an image or forge a document. And the more unstable our view of the past becomes, the weaker our ability to think critically about the present. That's why Orwell's lesson feels urgent. Protecting history isn't just the job of historians. It's a collective responsibility. Questioning official stories, looking for multiple sources, listening to silenced voices, and defending the right to memory are all forms of resistance. Yes, every generation reinterprets the past, but that interpretation must be grounded in a commitment to truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. That doesn't mean romanticizing the past or ignoring its failures. It means facing it honestly, in all its complexity and contradictions. When history is controlled by a few, it serves power, but when it's accessible and openly debated, it becomes a powerful tool for liberation. Knowing the past is essential if we want to imagine a different future, and that's why every attempt to silence, distort, or manipulate memory must be confronted with courage and clarity. In the end, Orwell's words still echo as both a warning and a call to awareness. Who controls the past controls the future. But maybe by truly understanding that, we can change the outcome and make sure the future isn't just a reflection of today's lies. Is the history we're told really the truth, or just the version of the people who won? Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most provocative thinkers in modern philosophy, strongly challenged the idea that history is a neutral, objective record of facts. For him, what we call history is actually something built from the desires and interests of those in power. It's not a mirror of the past. It's a frame created by the people who dominate the present. Nietzsche wrote, "There are no facts, only interpretations." This statement doesn't deny reality, but it points to something deeper. The way we choose to see, remember, and record events is always influenced by values, desires, and power struggles. No event speaks for itself. It's always told by someone, and that person has a point of view. This breaks with the traditional idea that history is a continuous timeline, guided by objective causes and impartial narratives. For Nietzsche, history is a battlefield of meaning. It's a space where winners impose their version of events, and by doing that, they shape not only the past, but what future generations will believe is true. When a group takes power, it doesn't just dominate militarily or economically. It also decides how the past will be remembered and what will be forgotten. Monuments are built for its heroes. Books praise its victories. Schools teach its values. Meanwhile, the defeated, the excluded, and the silenced disappear from official memory. Their voices, pain, and perspective become invisible. Nietzsche calls this an expression of the will to power, a central idea in his philosophy. The will to power isn't just the desire to control other people. It's a life force that pushes every being to affirm its way of existing, impose its values, and reinterpret the world from its own perspective. History, then, becomes a tool of that force. Powerful groups use the past to justify their worldview and extend their domination. And this isn't just abstract theory. Think about how many times history has been used as a political weapon. Authoritarian regimes, colonial empires, ideological movements. All of them created historical narratives that justified their superiority and made oppression seem normal. Colonization, for example, was long presented as a civilizing mission, while violence, destroyed cultures, and erased identities were pushed aside. What Nietzsche teaches us is that this kind of history isn't neutral. It's built to serve a purpose. More than just pointing out injustice, Nietzsche pushes us to recognize the power behind what we call historical truth. He invites us to look at dominant stories with suspicion and ask, who benefits from this version? Who was silenced in the process? What was left out, and why? This approach forces us out of passivity. Instead of accepting history as something finished, Nietzsche challenges us to become creators of meaning, questioners of narratives, and seekers of deeper interpretations. He isn't saying everything is a lie. He's saying truth is always contested. And because of that, it must be examined critically. A good example is how different societies deal with their own periods of oppression. In many countries, there's constant pressure to rewrite the past to soften their crimes. In others, there's an effort to recover forgotten stories and give voice to marginalized people. Both reactions show the same thing. History isn't fixed, it's alive, and it can be reshaped by the way we choose to remember and tell it. Nietzsche also warns about another danger, the paralysis caused by a monumental view of history. When we only celebrate the great achievements of heroes, when we treat the past as sacred and untouchable, we fall into a kind of worship that blocks real change. In that case, history stops freeing us and starts trapping us inside an ideal we're not allowed to question. That's why Nietzsche's critique goes beyond simple accusation. He argues for an active attitude toward history, one that recognizes many voices, the complexity of events, and the constant struggle for meaning. Instead of a history written only by winners, Nietzsche calls for space where different perspectives can exist, with the awareness that every interpretation carries a desire, a force, a will. Deep down, what's at stake is how we choose to live as a society. If we accept that history is a construction of power, then we can also use it as a tool for liberation. We can recover forgotten memories, value other perspectives, and challenge what once seemed unquestionable. And by doing that, we don't just understand the world, we change it. That's the power of philosophical criticism, not to destroy history, but to free it from the monopoly of the winners, to allow new readings to appear, new voices to emerge, and new truths to rise to the surface. Nietzsche didn't want us trapped in the past. He wanted us to have the courage to face it, and if necessary, overcome it. He wanted history to be not an anchor, but a push toward creating new paths. So whenever we hear a version of history, we should always ask, who is speaking? Who does this narrative serve? What other voices were left out? And what kind of future are we building when we blindly repeat the past? The phrase, "there are no facts, only interpretations," is not an invitation to blind relativism. It's a call to responsibility. Because if everything is interpretation, then we are responsible for how we interpret. And that means we have the power and the duty to build narratives that are more fair, more conscious, and more human. History is not only a reflection of what happened, it's a choice. And every choice reveals what we value and what we're willing to forget. Not every way of remembering the past is liberating. Sometimes what looks like a celebration of history is actually a subtle and powerful way of keeping everything exactly as it is. Friedrich Nietzsche, with his sharp mind and philosophical courage, dedicated part of his work to a strong critique of how we deal with the past. In particular, he exposes what he calls monumental history, the kind of history that focuses only on great achievements, great men, and glorious moments, turning them into sacred, untouchable examples. But what's the problem with that? At first, monumental history seems inspiring. It highlights heroes, major victories, and moments of greatness. It points to the best humanity has ever done. It seems to teach lessons about courage, strength, and genius. But Nietzsche warns us. This kind of history can become poison when it's used as a tool to preserve the dominant order. Monumental history selects only the events that benefit those in power. It ignores suffering, contradictions, and failure, and turns the past into an altar of idealized perfection. And by doing that, it blocks anything new, discourages change, and imposes a fixed standard of greatness that very few people dare to question. Nietzsche saw this as a way of paralyzing life, because when everything considered great has already been done, the present is left with only one option: repeat. History, instead of pushing us forward, starts to crush us. We live in the shadow of the giants of the past, measuring our lives by standards that don't always fit today's reality. He wrote, "An excess of history destroys life." And that's exactly what happens when monumental history takes over the collective imagination. It suffocates creativity, shuts down criticism, and turns the past into an unquestionable model. On top of that, this way of telling history almost always excludes voices that don't fit the glorious image. Where are women in the textbooks of great deeds? Where are marginalized people? Where are the struggles of the oppressed, the failures that taught something, the resistance that didn't win but still opened paths? Monumental history doesn't care about those stories. It prefers myth over reality, celebration over reflection. And because of that, it helps maintain power structures that hide behind the shine of the past. Nietzsche saw this manipulation as dangerous precisely because it's attractive. It seduces us with heroic images, national pride, and promises of future glory based on copying what came before. It's a version of history that justifies the present by saying, "Look what we did. We come from greatness. We don't need to change." But that story has a price. It blocks breaks. It blocks questions. It blocks anything new. Nietzsche argues that if life is going to grow, we need a more honest relationship with the past, one that doesn't worship it but confronts it. We need a kind of history that serves life, not the other way around. So what does that mean? It means remembering that the past isn't a weight we're forced to carry, but a force that can help us change the present. A living, plural history that invites us to think, act, and evolve. A history that doesn't just say, "Be like the ancients," but asks, "What world do you want to build from here?" Nietzsche describes 3 ways of dealing with the past: monumental history, antiquarian history, which clings to the past simply for the pleasure of preserving it, and critical history, the only one, in his view, capable of breaking conformity and making room for something new. Critical history looks at the past with courage, not to praise it, but to judge it. It understands that some moments must be overcome, some values must be challenged, and some structures must fall. It isn't afraid to confront idols. In fact, it knows that sometimes you have to break statues to build new paths. Nietzsche knew that history, when used the wrong way, could become a prison, but he also saw its power to transform, as long as it's guided by a real desire for truth, not an obsession with past glory. Today, his critique of monumental history feels more relevant than ever. We live in a time where the past is constantly used as a political weapon. Conservative groups invoke traditional values to block social progress. Authoritarian movements rewrite history to justify their hunger for power. Monuments to controversial figures are defended in the name of memory, even when that memory excludes, hurts, and oppresses. And that's where Nietzsche's message hits even harder. The past is not neutral, and the way we choose to remember it says a lot about who we are and who we want to become. Worshipping the past can feel like safety, but as Nietzsche shows, it can also be poison that freezes us in place, stopping us from dreaming of something different, stopping us from breaking away from what no longer serves us. Breaking free from monumental history doesn't mean rejecting history. It means looking at it with wider eyes, with deeper listening, with more courage. It means understanding that great achievements don't belong only to great men, but to everyone who, in some way, resisted, created, and transformed. It means remembering that true greatness isn't repeating what already happened. It's daring to do what has never been done. Nietzsche invites us to take history off its pedestal and bring it back to life. He wants us to use the past as a tool for growth, critique, and reinvention, to not be afraid of confronting myths, questioning truths, or imagining other paths. Because in the end, the past should not rule us. It should serve us as fertile ground for something new to grow. The history we know is almost always told from the point of view of the winners. But what about the defeated? Where are their voices, their pain, their struggles, forgotten in books, speeches, and celebrations? Walter Benjamin, a philosopher and cultural critic, proposes a deep break from the traditional way of understanding history. He rejects the linear, progressive, and triumphalist story that presents events as an inevitable march toward progress. Instead, Benjamin sees history as something built out of ruptures, catastrophes, and silence, especially the silence of the oppressed. In his Theses on the Concept of History, written in a hurry while he was fleeing Nazi persecution, Benjamin gives us the powerful image of the angel of history, inspired by Paul Klee's painting Angelus Novus. He describes this angel as a figure looking back at the past, where it sees one single catastrophe, a growing pile of wreckage rising toward the sky. The angel wants to stop and repair the damage, to give voice to the dead, to heal what was destroyed. But a storm pushes the angel forward into the future, and that storm is what we call progress. This metaphor is both moving and brutal. While official narratives celebrate achievements, advancement, and victory, the angel of history sees accumulated pain, shattered lives, and interrupted story. Benjamin forces us to face a disturbing truth. What gets praised as civilization is often built on the ruins of entire peoples. That's why he says, there is no document of civilization that is not also a document of barbarism. Every masterpiece, every monument, every celebrated accomplishment carries within it the suffering of those who were crushed so that it could exist. That is the logic of history told by the winners. It erases the screams of the defeated. And Benjamin rises up against that logic. For him, the real task of the historian, and of any conscious person, is not just to record facts, but to recover the voices of those who were silenced. It means digging through the rubble of the past for unrealized possibilities, abandoned dreams, and lives pushed into invisibility. It means giving memory a new purpose, not as glorification, but as redemption. Benjamin invites us to look at history from the perspective of the oppressed, and that changes everything. History stops being a straight line where everything seems to fit into a hopeful future, and becomes a constellation of broken tragedies, buried resistance, and delayed hope. This way of seeing is radical because it forces us to give up the illusion that history is fair or inevitable. Instead, it reveals that what happened could have been different, and so the future still can be. Every act of injustice that was forgotten is an unpaid debt. Every voice swallowed by time is a wound that still hurts. That's why Benjamin also says, the tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception, but the rule. That line hits hard because it destroys the idea of normal life. What is presented as an exception, war, repression, censorship, misery, is daily reality for the oppressed. What we call accidents or deviations in history is, for them, the structure of the world itself. Living under threat, being erased from official stories, fighting just to exist, this isn't rare. It's the norm. Benjamin isn't just criticizing, he's making a call for responsibility. If we keep telling history only through the eyes of the winners, we keep repeating symbolic violence that wipes out the defeated. We repeat the same mistake, turning barbarism into culture, oppression into heroism, silence into forgetting. That's why he proposes another way of relating to time, the present moment as a time of interruption, a now filled with urgency, where we can break the linear narrative and do justice to the past. That means acting in the present with historical awareness, not to repeat the past, but to rescue it from being erased. This idea is deeply political. It demands that we don't stay as passive spectators of history, but become protectors of memory. That we listen to the echoes of those who were never allowed to tell their stories. That we make room for other ways of narrating the world, more plural, more honest, more fair. You can apply this idea in many contexts. Think about how many stories of resistance were erased because they didn't fit the official script. Think about indigenous peoples who fought colonization and ended up reduced to footnotes. Think about women who played key roles in revolutions but had their names forgotten. Think about workers, enslaved people, migrants, the marginalized, history's forgotten angels. What Benjamin offers is not only a critique of official history, but an ethics of how we look. A way of seeing the world that rejects the comfort of the winner's story and searches for truth in the margins, the cracks, the ruins. He wants to wake us up to the fact that the past isn't dead. It still demands justice. And historical justice isn't just recognition, it's transformation. It's when we recover the memory of those who suffered, not just to pity them, but to learn from them, to avoid repeating the same mistakes, and to build a different future. In that sense, Benjamin's thinking is also a call to resist. Resist the numbness of history turned into entertainment. Resist the empty celebration of victories paid for in blood. Resist the idea that the world has always been like this and can't change. Because if the tradition of the oppressed teaches us anything, it's that even in suffering, hope survives. That even in catastrophe, there have always been people who fought, who dreamed, who said no, even knowing their voice might not last. That's the voice Benjamin wants us to hear. When we look at history through the eyes of the angel, we don't see only ruins. We also see unrealized possibilities, interrupted paths that can still be taken again, not to repeat the past, but to redeem it. True history is not the one that glorifies the winners. It's the one that refuses to forget the defeated. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, drop a comment telling me what stood out to you the most, and subscribe so you don't miss the next videos. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and stick around. There are more videos waiting for you. See you next time.